keep up the fight. We will apply maximum pressure to maximize our leverage. That's why today we're moving forward with a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the bills of hardworking Americans. Let me be clear, I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If necessary, if the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the...
Most Americans have no idea where their electricity comes from. They flip a switch and the lights turn on, and that is the end of the story. But imagine if that switch stopped working, not because of a storm and not because of a grid failure, but because a foreign leader decided to teach Washington a lesson. That is exactly what Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to do. They rely on our energy, he declared, and they need to feel the pain. Suddenly, what once looked like the most stable energy partnership in the world no longer looks so stable, and the consequences could reach American families within days. For decades, the energy relationship between Canada and the United States has been one of the quiet foundations of North American stability. Oil, natural gas, electricity, and refined fuels flow across the world's longest international border every day with very little public attention. But in recent weeks, that relationship has entered unfamiliar territory. Canadian officials and industry leaders have begun signaling frustration over a growing list of U.S. policies affecting energy infrastructure, pipeline approvals, cross-border electricity, trade, and market access. Publicly, the language remains diplomatic, yet privately, the tone is far more serious. The phrase being repeated in policy circles is simple yet powerful leverage. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. Millions of American homes, factories, and vehicles rely on Canadian oil, natural gas, and power. In many northern and Midwestern states, Canadian energy is not just an option, it is the backbone of the system. So when Canadian leaders begin talking about reevaluating energy cooperation, people in Washington listen carefully. This is not about a single pipeline or one regulatory dispute. It is about whether energy once seen as untouchable is becoming a strategic bargaining tool in a much larger trade and geopolitical standoff. Behind closed doors, officials familiar with the talks describe a growing sense in Ottawa that Canada is absorbing the costs of U.S. political and regulatory decisions without receiving the respect or access it believes it has earned. From delayed infrastructure approvals to shifting environmental standards and domestic manufacturing incentives, Canadian energy producers say the rules keep changing, and each change makes it harder to plan long-term investments that supply the American market. At the same time, Washington faces its own pressures. The U.S. government is trying to balance energy, security, climate commitments, and domestic industry protection, and that balancing act has created ripple effects across the border. Trade analysts say both sides are now quietly testing how much pressure the other can absorb. For Canada, energy represents one of its strongest negotiating tools. It does not sell to the United States out of convenience alone. It supplies because of geography, infrastructure, and decades of integration that cannot be easily replaced. For the United States, Canadian energy is not just cheaper in many cases. It is closer, more stable, and less exposed to global geopolitical shocks than imports from overseas suppliers. This is why the current moment feels different. Officials on both sides are no longer talking only about trade balances and regulatory alignment. They are talking about strategic dependencies. If this dispute were to escalate beyond words, the consequences would be felt far beyond government offices. Start with American consumers. A significant disruption in Canadian energy flows would put immediate pressure on fuel prices, electricity rates, and heating costs in large parts of the country. States that rely heavily on Canadian crude and power would feel the impact first, and national markets would follow soon after. For industries, the risks are even higher. Manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, and technology sectors all depend on stable and affordable energy. Even a small price spike can ripple through supply chains, raising costs for everything from food to building materials. For Canada, the stakes are equally serious. Energy exports represent a major pillar of the Canadian economy. Any prolonged reduction in access to the U.S. market would affect jobs, government revenues, and long-term investment in energy-producing regions. That is why analysts say neither side truly wants a confrontation. But history shows that when strategic assets become part of political negotiations, rational calculations can give way to public pressure and national pride. This is where the story becomes less about energy and more about influence. Because once a country signals that it is willing to use supply as leverage, the relationship changes. Trust becomes conditional. and every future negotiation carries an unspoken question about what happens the next time tensions rise. This is not the first time energy has been used as a geopolitical tool. Around the world, nations have learned that control over resources can shape alliances, shift power balances, and force political concessions. Europe's energy dependence on external suppliers over the past decade has become a textbook example of how economics and geopolitics can collide. North America has long presented itself as different. The Canada-United States energy relationship has been framed as a model of cooperation between allies built on shared values, integrated markets, and mutual benefit. Disputes have happened, yet they rarely threaten the core of the partnership. What makes this moment stand out is the broader global environment. International competition for resources is intensifying, and supply chains are being restructured. Governments are prioritizing domestic production and national resilience over pure market efficiency. In that context, even long-standing partnerships are being re-examined through a strategic lens. Trade experts note that Canada is also exploring ways to diversify its energy exports, looking toward overseas markets and new infrastructure routes. The United States, meanwhile, is investing heavily in domestic production and alternative energy sources to reduce dependence on any single supplier. These parallel efforts suggest that both sides are quietly preparing for a future where energy relationships are less automatic and more transactional. Publicly, officials in Ottawa emphasize cooperation and speak about shared goals, clean energy transitions, and the importance of a strong North American partnership. In Washington, the message is similar. American leaders highlight the value of Canadian imports and the strength of bilateral ties. But trade insiders point to a different conversation happening behind the scenes. They describe negotiations where energy is increasingly mentioned alongside tariffs, industrial subsidies, and regulatory standards, not as a separate issue, but as part of a broader package of leverage and concessions. The message, according to people familiar with the talks, is subtle yet clear. Canada wants predictability and fair access. The United States wants policy, flexibility, and domestic control. Both want to avoid a public clash, yet neither wants to appear weak. This creates a delicate standoff where every statement is carefully worded and every delay or policy shift is closely analyzed for hidden meaning. For many viewers, this might sound like a distant policy debate, but the reality is much closer to home. Energy prices influence the cost of living in ways that are often invisible until something changes. Heating bills, gasoline, grocery prices, and even housing costs are tied directly or indirectly to the price and availability of power and fuel. A stable energy relationship between Canada and the United States helps keep those costs predictable. A strained relationship introduces uncertainty, and markets react to uncertainty long before any actual disruption occurs. That is why even the suggestion of a potential shift in energy cooperation can move prices, influence investment decisions, and shape political conversations at the local level. Analysts say the most likely outcome is not a dramatic cutoff or an immediate confrontation. Instead, they expect a period of intensified negotiations, quiet compromises, and carefully staged public statements designed to reassure markets and voters alike. But they also warn that the underlying issues are not going away. As both countries pursue their own economic, environmental, and strategic priorities, friction is almost inevitable. And the question is whether that friction can be managed within the framework of cooperation that has defined the relationship for generations, or whether energy, once a symbol of partnership, becomes another arena for competition. Because this moment is about more than pipelines and power lines. It is about how two neighboring nations choose to navigate a world where resources are becoming strategic assets and alliances are being tested by global pressure and domestic politics. Canada and the United States have spent decades building one of the most integrated energy systems on the planet. What happens next will reveal whether that system remains a foundation of trust or becomes a tool of negotiation in a much more uncertain future. And that is a story the world will be watching closely.